It's hard to kind of like identify with Asian Americans, especially in the Bay Area, because you see a lot of East Asians being represented, like Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean, or other like ethnic Asian groups. Technically, I'm white because my people, like Afghans, are from the Caucasus Mountains region, I think. But then I'm also Asian because Afghanistan is in Asia. But if you were to ask me, or if you asked someone on the street if I were either of those things, like it'd be no. And so it's like you don't really know what boxes to check. You don't know what boxes you fall under. It's difficult when you don't really have the sense of community that other Asian groups have, like a strong Vietnamese community or a strong Chinese community. Like Afghans don't really have that, at least in the area that I grew up in. So a lot of it was a lot of isolation, a lot of trying to figure it out on your own. The nice thing about having a community, if you're a refugee or if you're a new immigrant, is that there are the members that of the group that already came before you, and so they can help you get on your feet and establish yourself. But we didn't have that, so it was really just our family holding each other up, So I guess their biggest thing in this life, the world that they built for themselves, is staying together, and anything that kind of threatens that is like not good. So I think what they're working towards is just stability and security, which I completely understand. But it's hard when those ideas clash with American ideas of freedom and self-expression, or not necessarily self-expression, but kind of like risk, I would say. I understand not wanting to take a lot of risks. I feel like I'm doing okay, like I'm fine with where I am now. But it's definitely really weird, I think, growing up without a feeling of a community or any pride in where you come from. It's hard because you're so aware of it's like East and West perspectives, and there's a huge difference between the expectations between both, where on one hand, the Eastern, it's like, very family oriented, very filial. It's very like a lot of expectations to be a certain way. And then you have the Western perspective, where it's much more independent, much more, I guess, liberal and freeing. And they both for sure have their pros and cons. I don't think you can say one is necessarily better than the other. You can pick aspects from both, which I think is the healthy way, in my opinion. But growing up as a kid, you don't really know that. You're absorbing all these values as a 10, 11-year-old, but you don't have the capacity really to judge them and weigh them as you would as an adult. So you're a kid growing up thinking like, what are my parents gonna think that I don't love them if I want to leave for college? That's a fear that I had, or who's gonna take care of my parents when I leave? And so I think almost every Asian American immigrant child can speak to that fear. And it's not something that, if you're a member of dominant mainstream white American culture, you necessarily have to think of, but it's something that I think all Asian Americans can relate to. Oh, it's caused a lot of trauma for sure, and it's trauma that still hasn't even fully unraveled, or for sure it's terrible. I came to this country as a refugee, so did my family, so did my extended family, and that's in and of itself is traumatizing. My mother, from about my age onward, lived in a constant period of war until moving to the United States. So she'd tell me things like, when I was your age, like for example, like comparing my American experience to her experience, I'll be like, you know, wanting to go out with friends, and she, you know, being more hesitant about me going out with friends, and I'll say, you know, like, you just never had like the experience that I had where you always want to go out with your friends and have a good time. And she's like, when I was your age, like, my friends would just disappear, you know, stuff like that. And so that puts that into perspective. It's really hard to overstate the impact that war has had, and it's kind of like, you don't really want to think about it, but you do, and I know my parents think about it all the time, and so does like the elders in my family, that life would have been a lot better if there was no war. Like, plans that you had, futures that you had set up, and just a whole life that you're working toward are just kind of torn away from you. You're transplanted into like this different world that you don't feel like you belong to. That's where they're at right now. And right now it's a process of like, how do I like work to heal that? There's an expectation for Afghan men to be very masculine and very sort of in control and authoritative, and that comes from, you know, just our culture from, you know, in Afghanistan. So I don't think it needs to be stated, but just how unhealthy that can be, about how like trying to be in control all the time, not being vulnerable, not, you know, showing your emotions, how unhealthy that can be. And like, you can look at domestic abuse rates in Afghan households, and it's very high. And that just goes to show that that's an issue that I think needs to be talked about. But because there isn't a lot of Afghan American representation in media or in a lot of outlets, there's no platform for that to kind of, you know, be brought to light or have justice brought to it. So I think that within my culture, but also within the greater Asian American cultures, we can talk more about what it means to be, you know, hyper-masculine, what that means, and if we can educate men about it.